Welcome to this third video clip in this series, and in this one we'll focus on allyship and action. And we've already discussed in the previous two clips, you've heard about BME teacher voices, you've heard from BME pupil voices around how they feel. You've also explored issues around race and racism and how they manifest within our school settings, and the impact that that has when it goes unchallenged, the professional isolation that BME teachers experience as a result. And this session hopefully will begin to think about your role within supporting these discussions and standing alongside your BME colleagues in challenging some of those aspects. So your role as an ally within race equality, within the race equality journey, and the action that's associated with that allyship. So really walking into the shoes of your BME colleagues and supporting them going forward. Allyship, folks, the quote that we've provided here from Gerald Wing Su is particularly relevant here to help you to begin to understand what it means to be an ally. And so allies are absolutely individuals who belong to this dominant social group, and through their support of non-dominant groups, so your minoritized BME colleagues work with them to actively challenge the discrimination that they experience within the workplace, and particularly if you are, if you witness anything that your BME colleagues experience, whether it's within a staff meeting, whether it's to do with, teaching and learning, anything. And we've just discussed the aspect of social groups in the previous session. Please be the voice, be able to stand with your colleagues and use your privilege to raise concerns and challenge the discussions that are going on to support your BME colleagues. Allyship here, as the slides suggest, you're moving away. It's that trajectory from awareness to your role within understanding race and racism, your growing understanding around those discussions and how it begins to manifest in both overt and covert ways, the intersectionality along that as well, but then moving towards beginning to think about how you can actually move forward and support those discussions, challenge the processes that are in place that you perhaps also feel that are not fit for purpose. So being prepared, it's that mind shift, folks. It really is beginning to look at things differently, critically, where you are reframing, reconstructing the narrative in order to support transformation, I guess, for the experiences of your colleagues. And be prepared not to get defensive. And a point I think here to note is that oftentimes when we have conversations around race or racism, around whiteness and so on, there's a real uncomfortableness around that. And when you take on allyship work, folks, it's about leaning into that discomfort and through having conversations with your colleagues, your BME colleagues in particular, learning about the experiences and the challenges that they face, then what happens is it allows you that process to move beyond that discomfort to a place where you become quite comfortable in starting to challenge what you are seeing in support of your colleagues. So that mind shift is really important for us to move away from in terms of becoming defensive. We really listen hard to the voices of our BME colleagues, so centering those voices and shifting that power dynamic where their voices have otherwise been denied and gone unrecognised. So please be mindful of that any conversations that you do have, you centre them around that. So you listen to them, you bring forth those voices together at meetings, at any discussions around curriculum, but that supportive nature that you are speaking with your colleagues in that regard. Yasmin, do you want to come in?
You've certainly touched on some incredibly important points there, and it's very much about being prepared to increase your self-awareness. So being more aware of your understanding of racial prejudice and racial discrimination in the first instance, then becoming more aware of how society, of how systems, processes and practices can be discriminatory for those from racial minorities, and then being prepared to actively champion action to instigate change. And allyship is very much about instigating change that will impact colleagues across the sector, ensuring that those voices that are not represented at this time, that are underrepresented, are amplified where appropriate to do so. But also about, by standing in solidarity, it's about building that stamina and that stimulus to bring about change. And certainly BME practitioners are very aware that they have been involved in this activity for decades, and yet we feel that we haven't made the progress that we would like to have made. It's about sustaining the momentum. It's about sustaining that dialogue and that debate further. In order to do that, we must engage with colleagues who up until this point feel that it doesn't impact them, who haven't perhaps been affected up until this point, or have perhaps considered themselves inappropriate to be an ally. And it's about having that discussion that actually, as a dominant group, you are very much an ally, and therefore it's about centering yourself as part of that discussion, that anti-racist discussion moving forward.
Yeah, allyship here again, folks. Individually, you can take actions, and that's really important. But in order for us to have sustained change and that continuous dialogue, it absolutely requires a systems change. We really need to be beginning to think about the leadership actually within our schools, and how from a leadership perspective can we I suppose continue these dialogues and questioning our practices to support. But that requires what's listed here as anti-racist stamina. We need to keep that discussion going. We need to deal with and address the challenges that our colleagues are experiencing. But there's also this notion of what it says, unexpected kickback from social justice colleagues. Now, you may receive, comments from folks saying, but what about other protected characteristics? And we need to be thinking about those also. And Yasmin touched on intersectionality in the previous video clip. So just be mindful of that, folks. Oftentimes, race does fall off the agenda because we begin to widen out those aspects from within our protected characteristics. But the focus here is on anti-racist practice. So just keep that as your focus. The other aspect, Yasmin, is we talked about centering and recognising and listening to the voices of our BME staff, but also the efforts, the work that they contribute to our school settings and workplace settings. Are they being recognised for the work that they are doing? And oftentimes we find BME teachers being called upon to interpret where they share the same first language, perhaps, within the parent community. They're asked to do things that are more culturally, relevant, in the sense of, you touched on it again, Ramadan, can you come and speak about that? Or perhaps the BME teacher is put forward to speak to the BME parent. But, do we recognise those efforts? Or again, is that linking to the whole stereotype narrative that we often find BME teachers associated with? So in terms of leading the agenda for change, who leads is very important here. And then we've mentioned that oftentimes BME teachers are not in those leadership positions, But when we are having discussions around race equality and the action that we want to take, it's really important that in those very beginning stages, those initial stages, that we prioritise the voices of our BME staff. Any action plan needs to be informed by their ideas, because they bring with them those lived experiences. They know what those challenges are like. They know some of the cultural needs of our BME pupils and parent community. So centre those voices, take on board those ideas, hear those experiences with what we have said here, in a sense, white action owners present. So really actually having you as colleagues taking that action forward. The areas within the action plan, again, are identified by both BME staff and anti-racist allies, and that you're taking forward that action. But actually, the most important aspect here is the accountability and responsibility. How are we going to monitor this? If the action plan is there, we are addressing a few of those areas. How do we look back to reflect on what progress is being made? And who's going to take responsibility for that progress and monitoring of that progress? And that's really important also, not to take our eye off the ball there, because it's very easy for other things to take place. I know that given the pandemic and remote learning currently at the moment that you're experiencing may have an impact, and we must keep that in mind.
Khadija, that poses the question that, or certainly emphasises the importance of the key areas. What areas are we going to focus on? What areas are we going to prioritise with respect to the Race Action Plan? The areas that we focus on will not be similar to other schools, and the Race Action Plan should very much be bespoke to each workplace and each learning environment. And often when Khadija and I have spoken about race action plans, race equality action within a particular school setting, often we're reminded that there is a race equality action plan for the local authority. However, every school is unique. Every school will experience its own challenges with respect to racial equality, and therefore it's incredibly important that the action plan reflects the workforce within the school. It reflects the immediate community, the learner community and the wider community. And it also is mindful of the areas that the school wish to focus on, because most schools are stretched for resource, and therefore it's incredibly important that the areas that are highlighted and will be focused on are relevant to that particular school.
We would also like to just thank Professor Rowena Arshad and her work, in race equality, particularly this aspect of allyship, and the discussions that we're having have been really informed by her work in the past. She recently did a webinar for Advance HE on allyship and action, and a lot of what we're discussing here reinforces what Professor Arshad has stated in terms of effective white allyship going forward. So many thanks to Professor Arshad for her insight in this work. It's really important to, when we talk about allyship, getting the right people championing race equality and inclusion. Particularly folks when we have our BME colleagues who, on a daily basis will try to have those discussions around race, equity, inequity in their personal and professional communities. But, they work tirelessly to do that. Some of it quite naturally evolves within their teaching and learning. For some of them, it really is a concerted effort to begin to challenge and question and encourage their young people to think about their experiences and make that relevant for them. But what they find is that they're often left isolated in doing that, or sometimes face criticism in being culturally responsive, and so therefore leaves them feeling demoralised and frustrated. And that tokenistic aspect, Jasmine, that we often come across, where some schools we have diversity week, or it's Chinese New Year, let's celebrate, it's Ramadan, and so we need to be very careful that we are not just promoting these aspects, which then do come across very tokenistic. Yasmin, it really has to be a conscious effort to really develop anti-racist practice within our school settings.
Khadija, I think that this is an opportunity to also perhaps take into consideration the concerns of allies, and certainly many of the white colleagues that I have worked with, particularly white male colleagues that I've worked with who have been incredibly supportive throughout my professional journey, have been concerned about being labelled as a white saviour. And the conversations that I've very much had have centred around authenticity. There's an authenticity when they ask me about my race, my religion, my culture. There's an eagerness to learn. When they speak thereafter about my race, about my ethnicity, about my culture, they are well informed, but they speak with authenticity, and they speak at moments where they feel that it will benefit me and it will benefit other BME professionals or other professionals who are underrepresented. They do not speak simply because it suits a particular agenda, their personal agenda. And it's certainly not influenced by political or social momentum at that time. And therefore, it's incredibly important that we reassure allies that if your intentions are certainly clearly communicated to BME colleagues, if the communication is open and transparent and there's a relationship of trust there, then I certainly don't anticipate that there would be any accusations of being a white saviour.
When taking on the role of a white ally, folks, it's particularly important to remember that you will come across some challenges, certainly, and Nado Eveling's work, she captures this really nicely and said that when we ask white practitioners to interrogate their own racialised class-based positioning, indeed it's quite difficult, and it's almost akin to hacking at our very roots. So it's something that will bring discomfort at times when you're dealing with issues, but actually it really is going to help you to move forward in that journey to becoming an effective white ally, because you really will start to question how that systemic racism functions within institutions. And we're going to be sharing, I think, with you a video when Robin DiAngelo talks about whiteness, white fragility and privilege, to further that discussion. But in terms of walking the talk, folks, that developing that anti-racist consciousness through really listening to your BME colleagues, because that's where you'll find the counter narratives. That's where you'll really hear about what they are experiencing and really help you to move beyond what we've mentioned earlier, that resentment, perhaps that guilt, or that defensiveness, where you really are becoming a critical friend, a friend that will speak with them in terms of challenging racist practice within school settings. So that brings a lot of discussions around, well, what's the important role that within the EIS, the BAME network plays within this anti-racist practice work, the role of union reps, or equality reps, local association secretaries, the role of our education leaders. Really important, folks, for us to begin to think about that. How will you take this work forward, and how does it help you to develop as effective white allies?
Certainly with respect to the role of the BME network, equality reps and union leaders, there's a sense of advocacy, self-advocacy with respect to speaking up for yourself and the experiences that you're having, the behaviours that you're observing in your workplace and out with by colleagues. There's an element of group advocacy where you may not necessarily be speaking up for yourself, but you're certainly speaking up for the collective teaching community in one way or another. And you're certainly raising awareness of issues that you are aware are affecting the professional community within the workspace and out with. And there's also an aspect of systemic advocacy, which is incredibly important. And as you raise your awareness of the experiences of BME practitioners, you will become more confident about being part of that process of bringing about change in policies and processes, practices, and guidelines that perhaps don't reflect the experiences of BME practitioners and perhaps don't protect BME practitioners in the best way they possibly could. And therefore, there are many different roles that the BME network, equality reps and union leaders are likely to take on in their many different capacities. Activism is very much about being actively involved, campaigning to bring about that change. And that change could be in your workplace and it could be in the wider sector. But it's as a result of that advocacy where you are speaking up for others, speaking up for yourself, supporting others, but then actively bringing about the change that you need to ensure that the workplace becomes more inclusive, that you start to recognise the value of networks, professional networks, and particularly allyship. And as a minority, as a BME network, it's more about encouraging allyship. Often as BME practitioners, for some reason, we take on the role of allyship as well. We will become allies for each other. And when we don't see the same progress, despite that allyship, we can become incredibly disheartened. But certainly if you are part of the minority group, then it's very much about encouraging that allyship from those who are in the dominant group within your professional sector, within your racial group, within social groups.
We've discussed before about how union reps and early secretaries can better support BME members. And I think the most important aspect here is the senior leadership support and endorsement. It's so key, folks, that our senior leaders are being prepared to talk about race equality and to talk about it over and over again. It's really important. And I guess also because if our senior leaders are racially literate and are comfortable in navigating those conversations, then we will begin to lead on looking at why our policies and practices perhaps may not be fit for purpose or may need modifying and adjusting to suit and so that they are responsive to every member within staff teams. Person who leads the initiative, ideally, again, we're saying needs to be from that senior leadership team, or wider perhaps. We also perhaps need to think about local authorities, Yasmin, the education local authorities in terms of who will really take that forward. I mean, I'm perhaps thinking here of directors of education. If we're looking at seniority, it really does go beyond even perhaps our senior leaders within schools. But the action to be informed by BME staff and our allies is really important there.
I guess also a heightened understanding of the various roles and responsibilities within trade unions too, within the workplace and out with the workplace is incredibly important. The BME network, whilst we have taken the opportunity to discuss the role of the BME network, by no means is the BME network tasked with encouraging anti-racist practice and anti-racist leadership, and we're incredibly aware that we cannot burden BME colleagues with the responsibility to address racism. it's simply a discussion that needs to take place across the sector, across organisational levels and across professional positions. And therefore, it's incredibly important that the conversations that we have are very much about how do the roles that exist across the EIS, that exist across schools, colleges and universities, how can they also intersect? How can they work together to ensure that we are addressing anti-racist practice and policies within the education sector?
Yeah, I think that's really important, because you're right. I was addressing here in terms of head teachers and directors of education within our local authorities, but even within the institution as EIS institution, we need to have that senior leadership buy-in to support. So yeah, absolutely agree with you, Yasmin.
With regard to the Race Action Plan, as well as focusing on key areas that you want to prioritise, it's incredibly important that you do define achievable goals, both for the short term, medium term and long term. And you assess progress with respect to those goals. Have they been achieved? And if they have been achieved, then that's success, and success should be celebrated, and it should certainly be shared with the wider school community, and it should certainly be acknowledged. And moving forward, it gives you an opportunity to gather incredibly important evidence. The reporting and supporting aspect is certainly an element of the Race Action Plan that requires a lot of attention, simply because without the reporting and supporting, you won't be able to build that evidence base that you need. And evidence provides an opportunity, a learning opportunity, particularly with respect to where we started from, what the current state of play is, and how we're progressing with respect to achieving the objectives that we've set out for the school. And therefore, it's incredibly important that we have clear reporting procedures with respect to racial discrimination, incidents of racial discrimination. It's also incredibly important that we take the opportunity to identify any visible or invisible barriers. And often staff surveys can be an opportunity to do that. It's an opportunity for you to assess how easy the reporting is, how clear it is, how simple it is. And also it's an opportunity for staff to provide that feedback anonymously. They don't necessarily need to consider themselves or need to either claim discrimination or consider themselves as a victim, which again can be a barrier. It's incredibly important that any discussions that are had with respect to reporting and supporting ensure a duty of care to the person who is affected by inappropriate behaviours on the basis of race, but also those who are addressing those behaviours. I think that's incredibly important. And make the use of local networks, whether it's the EIS, whether it's across the education sector, support groups. I think it's incredibly important to share good practice. When we talk about anti-racist leadership, we're often talking about the challenges, we're often talking about behaviours and practices that must be revised or reviewed or changed. As you progress, it's incredibly important that you take the opportunity to share good practice and to share your successes. I think that's incredibly motivating for colleagues across the sector, especially during incredibly challenging times. When it proves harder to have those discussions, particularly with senior leaders with respect to establishing a race action plan, or just having those difficult discussions with respect to the experiences of BME practitioners, perhaps consider proposing reverse mentoring and provide some examples of schools that have adopted reverse mentoring, and it's proving to be incredibly effective. It's certainly a way of breaking down the barriers between leaders and colleagues across the workplace or across the sector, and perhaps that lack of understanding with respect to the challenges that minority staff face, those that are marginalised in the workforce are likely to face. And therefore, reverse mentoring is a way where a worker in a colleague in a senior position is mentored by someone in a less senior position. It's a wonderful learning opportunity for the senior leader. It's a wonderful opportunity to walk in the shoes of colleagues. And for many, if it's from a different school, it may be the first opportunity that they've had to engage with a BME member of staff. And therefore, it's a wonderful opportunity to reconsider their views, some of their biases, some of the stereotypes that they've formed, particularly with respect to recruitment, progression, professional development, the curriculum that is being delivered within their school. And therefore, it's an opportunity. It's a learning opportunity both for the mentor and the mentee. And it provides a support for the mentee, and that confidence that actually there is change, there is change that is tangible. I'm involved in instigating change in a meaningful way that's beyond discussion within networks, because many BME colleagues are involved in many networks. They contribute to many working groups and steering committees, but they always feel that education leaders are missing from those conversations, that don't hear firsthand their experiences, and therefore they feel that it's not as impactful as it could be. Reverse mentoring is an opportunity to address that, and it's an opportunity for mentees to pose direct questions, and for mentors to also have the opportunity to, again, have those very informal conversations with respect to perhaps the lack of progress in a particular workplace. And therefore, it's an invaluable experience for both.
Absolutely. And I think perhaps I'll just add a little bit of caution to this, Yasmin. There has come up with some criticism in the past. And I think your point about the seriousness of it and being committed to this and to see impact from that relationship is really important, because otherwise, folks, if it just becomes yet another dialogue and nothing happens beyond the dialogue or conversation, then the purposefulness, the burden of representation again falls on BME colleagues. And where the mentee doesn't take this seriously, it can actually perhaps sometimes place the mentor in a very vulnerable position again. So just be mindful of that. But otherwise, a very useful approach to take to really begin those conversations, Jasmine. And then and I think if you can, you might be able to Google some YouTube clips on reverse mentoring, some really good clips that you can actually watch for yourself, and hear directly from the mentor and the mentee the benefits that they have found from engaging in that process.
So as a member of the BME network, or as an equality rep, or as a union leader, if you have observed a BME colleague being racially bullied and harassed, however, when you've taken the opportunity to reach out to the BME colleague, they don't consider the behaviour as bullying and harassment and don't wish to engage in any further discussion with you on the matter, but you've clearly been affected, what do you do? How do you take that forward, if you choose to take it forward? And this is a discussion that I think it's incredibly important to have, because in many instances we feel unless the person who we consider is directly impacted by that behaviour, if they choose not to address it and they choose not to acknowledge it, then there's simply nothing that we can do. However, in your role as advocates, there's certainly, if you choose to act on what you have observed, then you will acknowledge that you have also been impacted by the behaviour that you have observed. And when we observe discrimination, if you're part of a minority group, it impacts you in a different way. But as part of the majority group, it will also impact you. And therefore, it's about acknowledging the impact that it's had and having further discussions on that basis. And when you are assessing policies and practices and guidelines, perhaps looking at those policies and practices with that in mind. Do they represent the experiences of the victim? Do they also represent the experiences of those that have witnessed the behaviour, observed the behaviour, and also been impacted by it? And therefore, there's multiple responsibilities or perhaps roles that you may wish to assume. For some, there will be individual advocacy where you are very much speaking for the colleague because the BME colleague is quite comfortable with you speaking about it and perhaps on their behalf. Group advocacy with respect to the effect that those behaviours and that particular incident has had on a collective number of colleagues in the workplace. And thereafter, systemic advocacy, where you start to look at policies and processes and guidelines to ensure that inappropriate workplace behaviours are addressed for that particular colleague, for yourself, and to ensure that inappropriate workplace behaviours are appropriately addressed, and those that are involved in inappropriate workplace behaviours are held accountable, that there is a responsibility associated with inappropriate workplace behaviours to protect the workforce and to protect staff within the workplace. And therefore, you will find that you may assume many different roles in this particular scenario. BME colleagues are constantly assessing whether to react or not. And for some, it's that constant decision-making process. Do I react to this? If I do react, what are the consequences? If I don't react to this, is there a threat that this will be ongoing behaviour?
Yeah, because certainly there has to be a recognition that there's a reason why they don't wish to consider this, under bullying and harassment. Is there a fear there for the implications, perhaps, of calling such behaviour out? And perhaps that's the reason why they just want to dismiss it and not address the issue. But therefore, as a white ally in terms of a union rep, you may wish to engage in further discussions around that to support your BME colleague.
I think there is a fear. There's a fear that in the first instance, by actually acknowledging that I am a victim of racial discrimination, does that then suggest that I then need to act on it because I'm now aware of it, because I have now acknowledged it? I should act on it because it will either continue, it may not be a one-off, but also it then takes resource, emotional resource, cognitive resource, and that's exhausting. Yeah. And therefore, by utilising my resource and spending time thinking about this, thinking about how I want to take it forward, whether I want to take it forward, will I be taken seriously? What will the outcome be? Will I be supported? And what evidence do I need to gather? Am I in a position to gather that evidence? That's exhausting, that's time consuming, and yet I have a lot on my plate professionally and personally. So following the discussions that we've had during this session, if we could encourage you to now think about the Race Action Plan for your workplace, for your school, for your college, for your university, and what would that include? What areas would you focus on? Who would you reach out to within the EIS, within the workplace, across the education sector? Who do you think should be leading it? Who do you think should be involved? Whose voices should be amplified? And please do take the opportunity following this session to reach out to colleagues who have attended the interactive sessions, because they have also been prompted to think about the Race Action Plan and work together, share ideas, but certainly start to reflect on the anti-racist action and anti-racist behaviours that the race action plan should be taking into account.
So this case study is about a BME teacher who is frustrated at the number of times that they have tried to apply for a promoted post, and quite clearly stating here that I'm already undertaking the responsibilities required but never managed to secure the post. Why? And so how would you advise Farzana if she approached you as her equality rep or as her head teacher? What sorts of discussions would you be able to facilitate here to help Farzana begin to think about why she feels the way she feels, but also perhaps reflecting on your own discussions, particularly if you're a head teacher, about are there ways that you are promoting the work that the BME teacher is engaged in, or are there ways that you could perhaps help access promoted posts and support Farzana in preparing for applying for those particular posts? Can you identify what barriers might be in place there? Because clearly there's an issue in terms of the number of times that she has said that she's applied and not been successful. So some questions for you to be thinking about going forward.